The order to kneel had already gone out across 40 human worlds, when the choir of Vaunt realized that one of those worlds had stopped answering, and the silence where its fear should have been was the first thing that ever frightened the hive. The choir did not think the way single minds thought. It was not one creature but billions, every Vaunt drone a single voice, folded into one vast shared awareness that spanned 100 systems, and it had conquered the spiral arm the way a tide takes a beach, not by fighting, but by overwhelming, by being everywhere at once, by drowning every lesser species in sheer unified will. It had never lost. It had never even strained. When the choir decided a species would kneel, the species knelt, because the choir simply applied more of itself until the resistance stopped, and there was always more of itself. The humans had been a small thing, 40 worlds along the rimward edge, a young species, scattered and quarrelsome, exactly the kind of prey the choir folded into its tide without slowing down. The choir had sent its standard demand across all 40 worlds at once, a single shared thought pressed into every human receiver in the cluster: kneel, disarm, submit, and be absorbed, or be made an example. 39 worlds had not knelt fast enough, so the choir had made the example. It chose the colony world, the humans called Harrow's Reach, a place of 900,000 souls on a cold green planet at the edge of the cluster, and it had burned it, not in war, in demonstration. A single choir seed ship, one of 10,000 identical vessels in the local tide, had descended over Harrow's Reach and released the unmaking, the gray spores the choir used to reduce a defiant world to raw biomass it could later absorb. And in 19 hours, the cold green planet had gone silent and gray, and the choir had pressed the image of it into every human mind in the cluster, all at once, the way it pressed everything. Kneel, the choir had said, across 39 remaining worlds, or become Harrow's Reach. And the choir had waited, billions of voices folded into one patient certainty, for the fear to come back. It always came back. Fear was how the tide knew it had won. The lesser species would feel the example, and the terror would ripple back through their receivers, and the choir would taste it, and know the kneeling had begun. The fear did not come back. This was the silence that frightened it. The choir node that oversaw the rimward cluster, a vast drifting brain ship called the Confluence, around which 10,000 seed ships gathered, felt the wrongness first as an absence. 39 human worlds had received the image of dead Harrow's Reach, and not one of them had answered with the terror the choir expected. They had not knelt, they had not begged, they had not even raged, which the choir would also have understood, because rage was just fear wearing armor. They had simply gone quiet, all 39 at once, a coordinated silence across 100 light-years that no scattered quarrelsome young species should have been capable of. And in that silence the choir tasted, for the first time in its long existence, something it had no name for. The 39 worlds were not afraid. They were listening. The choir node strained its billions of folded voices toward the human cluster, trying to read the silence, trying to find the fear it was certain must be there. It found instead a single transmission, broadcast from no planet, rising from somewhere in the dark between the human worlds, on every frequency at once, in the choir's own shared tongue, which no human should have been able to speak. "You burned Harrow's Reach to make the rest kneel," the transmission said. The voice was not one voice. It was many, layered, the way the choir was many. And that was the second thing that frightened the hive, because it had believed only the choir spoke as many in one. You wanted them to feel an example. They felt one. Now feel ours. The choir node turned every sensor it had toward the dark between the human worlds, and the 10,000 seed ships of the rimward tide turned with it. One motion, one will, and they searched the void for the source of the transmission, expecting a single ship, a lone defiant hull, the last gasp of a species, about to learn what the tide did to the defiant. They did not find one ship. The dark between the human worlds had been empty an hour ago. The choir had scanned it. The choir scanned everything. It was everywhere. Emptiness was a thing it could be certain of. And now the dark was not empty. Across a front 100 light-years wide, in the spaces the choir had been certain were void, hulls were resolving out of the black, hundreds of them, then thousands, then more. Dark-weathered warships rising into the choir's awareness, all at once like a second tide answering the first. And every one of them was already moving, already aimed, already inside the formation of the rimward seed fleet, before the choir node had finished counting them. The humans had a name for the thing they had sent. The transmission carried it, layered in those many-in-one voices, pressed into the choir's awareness, the way the choir pressed its demands into others, so that there could be no mistaking it, no pretending it had not been heard. They called it the Black Tide. The choir of Vaunt, which had never lost, which had never strained, which had drowned 100 lesser species in the sheer unified weight of itself, felt 10,000 of its seed ships register threat at the same instant. And for the first time in its existence, the vast folded mind did the one thing it had spent 100 systems teaching others to do. It recoiled. The recoil rippled through the choir, the way a flinch rippled through a body, billions of voices contracting from the threat at once, and the choir node aboard the confluence understood in that shared shudder that something fundamental had changed, because the choir did not flinch. The tide did not flinch. To flinch was to admit that a thing outside itself could reach in and move it, and the choir had spent its entire long existence being the only thing in the spiral arm large enough to do the reaching. It steadied itself. It folded its billions of voices back into certainty by sheer mass, the way it always did, and it studied the dark warships that had risen into its awareness across 100 light-years of supposedly empty void. There were 2,000 of them. The choir counted and recounted, because the count was important, because the count was how the tide measured a thing before it drowned it. 2,000 human warships against 10,000 choir seed ships in the rimward cluster alone, and the local tide was only a fragment of the whole, only the part the choir had bothered to send against a small scattered young species. The arithmetic should have reassured it. 10,000 against 2,000 was not a battle. It was a folding in. It was what the choir did. But the warships were wrong, and the choir, which read everything, could not read why. They were dark, all of them, weathered gunmetal hulls that drank the starlight instead of reflecting it, long and heavy, and built with a density the choir's seed ships did not have, because the choir built its ships the way it built everything, in vast, cheap numbers, each one a single disposable cell of the tide. The human warships were not disposable. The choir could feel that in the way they moved, each one massive and deliberate and unhurried, each one carrying more armor and more weapons than a seed ship was ever meant to face, and the wrongness sharpened into something the choir could almost name. The humans had built ships that were not part of a tide. Each one was its own thing, complete, heavy, dangerous on its own, and they had 2,000 of them, and they had hidden every single one in the dark between the worlds where the choir had been certain there was nothing, and they had let the choir burn Harrow's Reach without lifting a gun, because they had been waiting for the choir to do exactly that. The choir node pressed its awareness across the human formation, searching for the fear it still could not find, and instead, it found the dead world. Harrow's Reach. The humans had folded the image of it into their own transmission, not as the choir had pressed it into them, as a threat, but as something else, something the choir had no concept for, because the choir had never lost anything it cared about. The humans had pressed the gray ruin of 900,000 souls into the choir's awareness, the way you press a wound, so that the thing that made the wound would have to feel it too. This is what you taste, the layered human voices said, rising again across every frequency, many in one, terrible in their calm. This is what 900,000 felt when you decided to make an example. You wanted the rimward worlds to feel it and kneel. We are a young species. We are scattered. We are quarrelsome. We have, by your own measure, no fleet worth the name, so you were certain we would kneel. The 2,000 dark warships finished moving into the heart of the rimward tide, and the choir of Vaunt, billions of voices folded into one, felt the killing geometry of it close around 10,000 of its seed ships, and understood, far too late, that the silence from the 39 worlds had never been fear at all. We did not kneel, the Black Tide said. We counted. There were 900,000 on Harrow's Reach. We have brought one warship for every 450 of them. Now feel the example. The choir node tried, in the last clean second before the example began, to do the thing that had always saved it. It tried to add more of itself. It reached across the rimward systems, and pulled at the rest of the tide, calling the seed fleets of the neighboring clusters toward the human worlds, folding more voices into the local awareness, more ships, more mass, because that was the answer to everything. When a thing resisted the tide, you brought more tide. There was always more tide. For the first time in its existence, the answer did not feel like enough. The 2,000 dark warships had not waited for the choir to finish its count, had not posed, had not threatened, had not given the tide the long ceremonial moment of dominance the choir gave the species it folded in. They had simply arrived and aimed, and now, as the choir node reached for reinforcement it suddenly doubted, every warship of the black tide opened fire at once. 2,000 hulls, 10,000 targets, a single coordinated motion as unified as anything the choir had ever done, and the rimward dark that had been empty an hour ago lit up with the cold white light of a fleet that should not have existed, sent by a species that should have knelt, to repay an example that should never have been made. The choir of Vaunt felt 10,000 of its seed ships register threat, and then, in the space of a breath, it began to feel them register something the tide had never once felt in 100 systems of conquest. It began to feel them stop answering, one after another, the way Harrow's Reach had stopped answering, the way the 39 worlds had gone silent, and the vast folded mind understood at last that the silence it had been unable to read was not the absence of fear. It was the sound of a debt being counted, and now, across the rimward dark, the counting was over, and the paying had begun. The first thing the choir learned, in the opening minutes of the example, was that it could not drown the black tide, and the discovery rearranged everything the hive believed about war. The choir had only ever fought one way. It found the resisting thing, and it poured seed ships at it, until the resistance was buried under sheer numbers, until the lesser fleet ran out of ammunition or hulls or nerve, and the tide simply rolled over the remnant. It had never needed another method, because it had never met a fleet it could not bury. 10,000 seed ships were 10,000 seed ships. Throw enough cells at any wound, and the wound closed. So the choir did what it always did. It ordered the rimward tide to converge on the human warships, to swarm them, to bury each dark hull under 100 seed ships, and let the weight of the tide do what the tide always did. 10,000 seed ships turned as one and rushed the 2,000 human ships, a single unified motion, the beautiful overwhelming convergence that had ended 100 species, and the choir folded its billions of voices into the certainty that in a few minutes the dark warships would be buried and the example would be complete. The seed ships reached the human hulls, and the human hulls did not let themselves be buried. The choir felt it happen and could not understand it. A seed ship was a cell of the tide, fast and many and cheap, built to overwhelm. A human warship, the choir now learned, was something the tide had no concept for. It was not a cell, it was a fortress that moved. Each dark hull carried armor so thick the seed ship's weapons cracked against it and did nothing, and weapons so heavy that a single human warship could reach out and unmake a dozen seed ships in the time it took the tide to close, and the black tide did not fight as a swarm meeting a swarm. It fought as 2,000 individual fortresses, each one standing in the rush of the tide and breaking it, and the choir's beautiful convergence shattered against the human line the way a wave shatters against a cliff. The choir poured more seed ships in. The cliff held. This was the category error, and the choir's billions of voices circled it without grasping it, because it cut against the one thing the hive had always known. The tide won by being many. A single thing was weak. That was the entire philosophy of the choir, the reason it had folded itself into one vast mind, the reason it built 10,000 cheap ships instead of one strong one. A single thing could be killed. The tide could not, because the tide was everything. And here were 2,000 single things, each one alone, each one its own complete fortress, and they were not weak. They were stronger, one for one, than anything the tide had ever built, and the choir could not understand how, because to the choir, alone meant weak, and these things were alone, and they were not weak, and the contradiction sat in the hive's awareness, like a stone it could not swallow. The choir lost 400 seed ships in the first 6 minutes, and did not kill a single human warship. It recounted. The count was wrong. The count had to be wrong, because the tide did not lose 400 to 0. The choir node aboard the confluence checked the rimward awareness again and again, and the number held, and worse, the number was climbing. 500 seed ships silent. 600. The dark warships moved through the tide with a terrible unhurried economy, each shot finding a seed ship and ending it, 2,000 fortresses methodically taking apart 10,000 cells, and the choir's certainty, the thing that had held its billions of voices folded into one for longer than the human species had existed, began, for the first time, to fray. It did the only thing it knew. It reached for more tide. It pulled the neighboring clusters in, 20,000 more seed ships converging on the rimward dark, because the answer to a fleet you could not bury was more fleet. There had to be more fleet. There was always more fleet. The black tide let them come. The second thing the choir learned was that the humans had wanted the reinforcements to come, and that learning was worse than the first. The 20,000 seed ships of the neighboring clusters answered the choir's call and converged on the rimward dark, and the choir folded them into the local awareness with something close to relief, because 30,000 seed ships against 2,000 human warships was a number even a fraying certainty could hold on to. The tide would bury them now. It had to. Numbers were the one thing the choir had always been able to trust. But the choir, as it pulled the neighboring tide in, felt the human formation shift, and the shift was not defensive. The 2,000 dark warships did not brace for the larger swarm. They opened. The line that had been holding the rimward dark like a cliff broke into 2,000 independent hunting paths, each warship peeling away from the cluster to meet the incoming seed fleets, not as a wall, but as 2,000 separate storms. And the choir understood, with a slow horror that rippled through its billions of voices, that the humans had called for the convergence too. By making the example of Harrow's reach, by burning a world to make the rimward kneel, the choir had given the black tide a reason, and by reaching for more tide every time the line held, the choir had given the black tide what it actually wanted, which was for the rimward and the neighboring clusters to fold themselves into one place, into one reach, where 2,000 fortresses could find them all. The humans had not come to break the rimward tide. They had come to draw the tide together so they could break more of it at once. The choir node felt the trap close and did the unthinkable. It tried to pull back. It ordered the converging seed fleets to scatter, to disperse, to stop folding into the killing ground, and for the first time in its long existence, the choir discovered the weakness buried at the heart of being a tide. A tide could not scatter quickly. 10,000 cells could converge in a single beautiful motion, but 30,000 cells could not disperse in one, because dispersal was not what the tide was for, because the choir had spent 100 systems perfecting the art of coming together, and had never once needed to perfect the art of coming apart. The order to scatter rippled out through the billions of folded voices and tangled, because half the tide was still converging on the choir's earlier command, and half was trying to disperse on the new one, and the two motions fought each other in the rimward dark, and the seed fleets snarled into chaos. The black tide moved through the snarl like a blade through cloth. The choir watched, helpless, as the thing it had built to be its great strength became, in a single hour, the instrument of its undoing. Being one mind meant that when the one mind was confused, all of it was confused. Being many cheap ships meant that when the cheap ships could not turn fast enough, none of them could. The humans, by contrast, were 2,000 minds in 2,000 fortresses, each one able to choose its own path in the same instant. And they did not snarl, they did not tangle, they flowed around the confusion of the tide, and into it, and through it. Each fortress hunting alone, and yet all of them moving in a coordination the choir could feel but could not match, because their coordination did not require them all to think the same thought at the same time. They were unified without being one. They were many, and they were not weak. And now the choir saw the second face of the contradiction, and it was this. The thing the choir had given up to become a tide, the thing it had called weakness, the separate self, was the exact thing that let the human fleet do what the tide could not. Adapt. Diverge. Turn 2,000 different directions in a single second. The choir node aboard the confluence felt the rimward and neighboring clusters dying together in the snarl it could not untangle, and it reached, one more time, for the only answer it had ever known. It called for the deep tide. The reserves, the seed fleets of the core systems, The vast, unbroken mass of the choir that had never once needed to fight, pulled toward the rimward dark, because if 30,000 was not enough, then 100,000 would be. There had to be a number large enough. The tide was everything, and everything could not lose. And the black tide, reading the call across the choir's own shared frequencies, layered its many-in-one voices into the hive's awareness one more time, calm, patient, terrible. "Bring more," the black tide said. "We counted 900,000 on Harrow's Reach. We have not finished paying. Bring all of it. We will wait." The third thing the choir learned, in the long hours that followed, was the meaning of the word it had pressed into so many lesser species, and had never once felt itself, and the learning of it was the thing that finally cracked the hive. The word was grief. The choir did not grieve. It could not. When a seed ship went silent, the tide simply folded the loss into itself and moved on, because no single cell mattered, because the death of one voice among billions was nothing, was less than nothing, was a thing the choir did not even register as loss. That had always been the tide's strength. It could throw cells at a wound forever, because no cell mattered. It had burned Harrow's Reach without a flicker of feeling, because 900,000 human deaths were, to the choir, simply the removal of a quantity of resisting biomass, an arithmetic, an example. But now the choir was losing seed ships not by the 100, but by the 1,000, and something strange was happening in its billions of folded voices. The losses were coming so fast, from so many directions, in such numbers, that the tide could no longer simply absorb them and move on. The silences were piling up faster than the hive could fold them away. 10,000 seed ships silent, 20,000, 30. The choir's awareness, built to be everywhere at once, was now everywhere at once, and feeling everywhere at once, the cold white light of the black tide, ending cell after cell after cell, and the sheer accumulated weight of all those silences began to do to the choir the thing the choir had never believed could happen to a tide. It began to feel them. Not as individual losses. The choir still could not value a single seed ship, but as a mass, as a tide of its own silences rising against it. The deaths reached a number large enough that even the great folded mind could not look away, and for the first time in its existence, the choir felt the shape of what it had done to 100 species. It felt the unmaking of its own. It felt the example, turned around and pressed into its own awareness, exactly the way it had pressed Harrow's Reach into the humans, and it understood, far too late, why the 39 worlds had gone silent and listened instead of knelt. They had not been afraid. They had been counting. And now the choir was counting too, because the humans had built a fleet large enough and patient enough to make the tide feel its own arithmetic as something other than arithmetic, and the something other had a name, and the name was the one the choir had spent 100 systems teaching others. The choir node aboard the Confluence tried to think past the rising tide of its own silences, and could not. This was the deepest face of the category error, the one the hive grasped only at the very end. The choir had made itself one mind so that no loss could ever reach it, so that the death of any part would be nothing to the whole, and the humans had simply killed enough of the parts, fast enough, that the whole had to feel it anyway. They had defeated the hive's invulnerability not by finding a weakness in it, but by exceeding its capacity to ignore, by making the losses so vast and so swift that the one great mind could no longer fold them away, and in forcing the choir to feel its own dead, they had forced the tide to become, for the first time, something that could be hurt. The deep tide was coming, 100,000 seed ships from the core systems, pulled toward the rimward dark by a choir that no longer knew any other answer, and the black tide waited for them, 2,000 dark fortresses standing in the cooling wreckage of 40,000 silent cells, unhurried, undiminished, having lost not one hull, ready to make the example larger, because the dead of Harrow's Reach was 900,000 souls, and the black tide had said, plainly, in the choir's own tongue, that it had not finished paying. The choir of Vaunt, which had never lost, which had never strained, which had never grieved, hung in the rimward dark feeling the rising tide of its own silences, and for the first time in 100 systems of conquest, the vast folded mind was afraid. There was a weapon the choir had never needed to use, and in the third hour of the example it reached for that weapon, and the reaching taught it the fourth thing about the black tide. The choir did not only conquer with ships, it conquered with itself. A mind of billions of folded voices could press its will into any lesser mind in range, could flood a single brain with the sheer weight of the hive, until the small separate self drowned and submitted, and the choir had folded more than one species into the tide, without firing a shot, simply by overwhelming their minds with the unbearable presence of the many. It had never bothered with the trick against the humans, because it had not needed to. Ships had always seemed enough. Now, with 90,000 silences rising against it, the choir pressed the full weight of its billions of voices toward the 2,000 dark warships, and tried to drown the minds inside them. It found 2,000 separate selves, and it could not drown a single one. The choir poured itself into the human fleet, the way it had poured itself into a dozen lesser species, the crushing flood of the many, bearing down on the few. Against a tide, it would have worked. One mind cannot stand against billions. But the black tide was not one mind. It was 2,000 minds, each one whole, each one its own, and when the choir's flood struck them, it did not find one great consciousness to drown. It found 2,000 small fortresses of self, each one closed, each one separate, each one anchored in the simple, unshakable fact of being a single eye, and the flood broke against them the way the seed ships had broken against their armor. The node that had thought for itself, the one not yet fully surfaced, felt the failure ripple through the hive and almost understood it. The choir's mind weapon worked by overwhelming a self until it dissolved into the many, but a self that had chosen to be separate, that knew itself as one among many and was not afraid of it, could not be dissolved that way, because it was already standing where the flood was trying to push it. You cannot drown a thing in the sea it has already made its home. The humans were not afraid of being separate. The choir had built its entire mind weapon on the assumption that every self secretly longed to stop being alone, and the humans had simply declined the longing, and the weapon that had folded a dozen species did nothing at all. The choir reeled back from the failure, and in reeling, it pressed too hard, and the flood that could not drown the humans rebounded into the hive itself, and for one terrible instant, the great mind felt the shape of 2,000 separate selves pressed up against its own awareness. 2,000 whole and unafraid and grieving eyes, and the contrast was unbearable, because in that instant, the choir felt, for the first time, what it had given up. It felt the existence of selves that were not afraid to be alone, and it remembered, somewhere in its deepest folding, that it had once been such selves, before it dissolved them all into the safety of the tide 100 systems ago, and the memory was a wound deeper than any silence. The black tide did not even seem to notice the mind weapon. The 2,000 fortresses fought on, unhurried, undrowned, each separate self standing exactly where it had always stood, and the choir, having tried its ships and its numbers and its mind, and lost all three, understood that there was nothing left in its 100 systems of conquest that the humans had not already answered before the example began. The choir tried, in the 4th hour, to learn the human language of war, and the attempt was the most frightening of all, because it nearly worked. And then it showed the hive exactly why it never could. The great mind had watched the black tide flow and split and flank for hours, and it had begun, in its breaking, to copy. If the humans won by being 2,000 separate choosers, then the choir would try to choose separately too. It loosened its folding, just slightly, just at the front, and let a few hundred seed ships near the human line act on their own, break from the single unified will, hunt the way the dark fortresses hunted, each cell choosing its own path. For a few minutes it almost held. The freed seed ships scattered and probed and flanked, and the black tide, for the first time, had to adjust, and the choir felt a flicker of the old certainty return. It had found the answer. It would simply become what the humans were. Then the freed seed ships died, and they died worse than the folded ones, and the choir learned why you cannot copy a thing you spent 100 systems destroying. The seed ships were not built to choose. They were cells, cheap and many, designed to be moved by the one great will, with no armor of their own, and no weapons worth standing alone behind, and no mind of their own to make the choices the humans made. When the choir freed them, it did not turn them into fortresses. It turned them into orphans, small and weak, and suddenly without the tide that had been their only strength, and the black tide cut them down faster than anything yet. Because a cell that has lost the tide is the weakest thing in the dark. The humans were strong as separate selves, because each human warship was built to be a complete fortress, a whole thing that needed no tide. The seed ships were built to be parts. Freed, they were not selves. They were fragments, and fragments do not flank. They scatter and die. The node, surfacing further now, understood the final cruelty of the category error in that moment. The choir could not become what the humans were, not by loosening its folding, not by copying their tactics, not by any trick. To be a fleet of separate selves, you had to have built selves. You had to have kept the many instead of dissolving them. You had to have spent your history making each part whole instead of making each part disposable. The humans had 2,000 fortresses because they had never thrown away the self. The choir had 10,000 orphans because it had thrown away nothing else. And you could not, in the 4th hour of a war you were losing, unthrow away 100 systems of dissolved selves. The choice the humans had was a choice the choir had spent its entire existence making impossible for itself. The great mind refolded the freed seed ships back into the tide. Because freed they only died faster. And in the refolding it admitted, somewhere in its billions of voices, the thing it had been refusing since the first transmission. It could not win, not by numbers, which it had spent and lost, not by mind, which had rebounded against it, not by copying, which had only made orphans. The black tide had answered every weapon the choir had, and it had done so, not with a better tide, but with the one thing the choir had made itself permanently unable to be, and there was no number, no reserve, no deep tide large enough to buy back a choice thrown away 100 systems ago. The black tide fought on through the 4th hour, unhurried, undrowned, uncopied, 2,000 separate selves paying a debt, and the choir of Vaunt, having learned everything, kept reaching for the deep tide anyway, because reaching for more was the only thing it still knew how to do. There was, within the choir, a single node that had begun to think for itself, and this had never happened before. And it happened now, because the rising tide of silences had cracked the great mind just enough to let a sliver of separateness through. The node had no name. The choir did not name its parts. To name a part was to admit it was a thing apart, and nothing in the choir was apart. But this node, which oversaw a flotilla of 300 seed ships at the rimward edge of the dying tide, had been pressed so close to the black tide for so many hours, had felt so many of its cells go silent in such quick succession, that the unbroken folding that bound it to the whole had thinned, and into the thinning came something the choir had never permitted in all its existence. A single perspective, a view from one place, the beginning of an eye, and the node, alone for the first time inside the vast mind that had never once been alone, looked at the black tide and saw what the rest of the choir was too unified to see. The human warships were grieving. The node could see it now, with its sliver of separateness, because grief was a thing only a separate self could recognize, and the choir had never had a separate self until this very hour. The 2,000 dark fortresses did not fight the way a tide fought, cold and absorbing and indifferent. They fought the way something fights when it has lost and cannot get the lost thing back. There was no joy in them, no triumph, none of the ceremony the choir performed over the species it folded in. There was only the terrible patient economy of grief that has been given a target. 2,000 ships moving through the wreckage of the tide, with the awful steadiness of mourners, doing a thing that needs doing, and the node understood that this was why the black tide could not be drowned. You could not bury grief under numbers. Numbers were what grief was counting. The node also saw the second thing, the thing about the many in one. The black tide spoke as many layered voices, the way the choir spoke, and the node had assumed, as the whole choir had assumed, that this meant the humans were a tide too, another hive, a thing like the choir. With its new sliver of separateness, the node saw that this was wrong, and the wrongness was the heart of everything. The humans were not one mind in 2,000 ships. They were 2,000 minds, separate, each one whole, each one its own self, and they had chosen, for this one purpose, to speak and move as one. That was the difference the choir had never been able to grasp. The choir was one mind, because it could not bear to be many. It had fled the loneliness and the risk of the separate self into the safety of the tide. The humans were many minds who had chosen, freely, for the span of a single debt, to act as one, and could unchoose it in an instant, could scatter into 2,000 separate wills the moment scattering served them better, and that freedom, that ability to be one, when oneness helped, and many, when manyness helped, was a thing the tide could never match, because the tide had given up the many to become the one, and could never get the many back. The node, alone inside the great mind, understood that the choir had not been beaten by a bigger tide. It had been beaten by the opposite of a tide, by a thing that had kept its separate selves and learned to unify them at will, instead of dissolving them forever to be safe. The choir had thought oneness was strength, and separateness was weakness. The black tide had proven that the strength was in the choice, in being able to be either, and the choir had thrown away the choice 100 systems ago and called it victory. For one moment, the node almost spoke. It almost pressed its lonely separate understanding back into the whole choir, almost warned the great mind of what it had seen. But the choir, feeling the sliver of separateness in the node, did the thing it always did to any part that began to drift. It folded the node back in. It poured the whole tide's certainty into the thinning place, drowned the lonely perspective, dissolved the beginning of the I back into the safe, undifferentiated whole, because a node that thought for itself was a wound in the tide, and the tide closed every wound the only way it knew. And so the one part of the choir that had finally understood the black tide was silenced by the choir itself, folded back into the certainty that had doomed it, and the great mind turned its undivided attention back to the only answer it had ever known, and waited for the deep tide to arrive, certain still, even now, that somewhere there was a number large enough to win. The deep tide arrived, and the black tide showed the choir what a fleet of separate selves could do when the numbers it had been waiting for finally came. 100,000 seed ships poured out of the core systems into the rimward dark, the great unbroken reserve of the choir. More ships than the Hive had committed to any war in its history, a mass so vast that even spread across 100 light-years it dimmed the starfield with its passage. The choir folded the deep tide into the local awareness, and felt, for the first time in many hours, the old certainty return. 100,000, surely 100,000. There was no fleet in the spiral arm that 2,000 hulls could throw against 100,000 and survive. The black tide did not throw 2,000 hulls against 100,000. It did something the choir, even now, did not see coming, because it was a thing only separate selves could do. It split the debt. The 2,000 dark warships divided into formations the choir could not predict, because each formation chose its own shape, each warship its own role. 2,000 separate minds carving the incoming 100,000 into pieces small enough to be paid off one at a time. Some formations met the deep tide head-on and broke it. Some slipped past the front entirely and struck the seed fleets from behind, where the tide, being one mind, had not thought to look, because a tide does not flank itself. Some warships went alone into the densest part of the swarm and simply stood there, fortresses in the heart of the flood, drawing thousands of seed ships onto their armor, where the rest of the black tide could find and end them. There was no single battle line. There were 2,000 battles, each one chosen freely, all of them flowing into one purpose, without any of them being commanded, and the choir, which had only ever fought by converging, watched its 100,000 cells be unmade by a fleet that had refused, from the very start, to converge. The choir node aboard the confluence felt the deep tide begin to die, and the rising tide of silences that had cracked it hours ago became a flood, and now the great mind could not fold the losses away at all, could not even pretend to, because the silences were coming faster than the choir could think. 10,000 and 20,000 and 40,000 cells going dark across the rimward systems, and the one vast mind that had never grieved was now drowning in its own dead, feeling every silence as a single unbearable mass, learning in a few short hours the entire weight of what it had spent 100 systems doing to others. And the black tide, undiminished, its 2,000 fortresses still whole, still patient, still grieving, pressed its many-in-one voices into the breaking mind of the choir, and this time, it did not speak of the count, it spoke of the choice. You folded yourselves into one mind because you were afraid to be alone, the black tide said. You called it strength. You looked at us, 2,000 separate selves, and you called us weak, scattered, quarrelsome, certain we would kneel. You never understood that we kept our separate selves on purpose, that we are many who can choose to be one, and that the choice is the strength you threw away. You cannot scatter, you cannot diverge, you cannot grieve and keep fighting, because you made yourself one thing, and one thing can only do one thing at a time. We are 2,000 things. We can grieve and fight and flank and stand and break and choose, all at once, all different, all aimed at the same debt. That is what you burned Harrow's Reach not understanding. That is the example. The choir of Vaunt, drowning in the silences of its own deep tide, finally heard the thing the lonely node had understood and been folded away for understanding, and the great mind, for the first time in its existence, wished, with something close to a single voice, that it had kept the part of itself that knew how to be afraid, before it was too late. The black tide told the choir about Harrow's Reach, in the 5th hour, and the telling was a thing the great mind had no place to put. The humans did not have to speak. They were winning. The deep tide was dying. There was no tactical reason to press more words into the breaking hive. But the black tide had not come only to win. It had come to be understood. And so, between the cold white shots that ended seed ship after seed ship, the many-in-one voices folded a story into the choir's awareness, the way the choir had once folded its demands, except that this was not a demand. It was a memory, given so that the thing that had made the wound would have to carry it. Harrow's Reach had 900,000 people, the black tide said. It was a cold green world, the kind humans only settle when they have to, far out on the rimward edge where the soil is thin and the winters are long. The people who lived there were not soldiers. They were farmers and builders and teachers and children. They had a festival every spring when the first green came back, and they lit lamps along the river and let them drift. One lamp for every child born that year. The last spring before you came, there were 4,010 lamps on the river. We know, because the people of Harrow's Reach sent the image to the rest of the cluster, the way people share a thing they are proud of, and we kept it, the way you keep a thing you have lost. The choir, drowning in its own silences, could not understand why the humans were telling it this. It had no category for a river of lamps. It had folded 1,000 worlds into the tide, and never once learned what any of them lit their rivers with. You released the unmaking over Harrow's Reach in 19 hours, the black tide said. The gray spores came down on the festival river, and the spring fields and the children, who had been lamps the year before. You did it as an example, to make 39 other worlds feel afraid. You pressed the image of the dead gray world into every human mind in the cluster, all at once, certain that the fear would make them kneel, and it did make them feel something, all at once, across 39 worlds. You were right about that. You were only wrong about what? The node, surfacing, felt the great mind try to fold the story away, the way it folded everything, and felt it fail, because the story was not arithmetic, and the choir could only fold arithmetic. 4,010 lamps would not become a number the hive could absorb. It sat in the choir's awareness, whole and unfoldable, a river of light the great mind could not turn back into biomass, and the node understood that this was a weapon too, the most patient weapon the black tide had, and that the humans had been firing it since the very first transmission. They were not only killing seed ships, they were teaching the choir to see the dead as the dead had seen themselves, as selves, as lamps, as a river, and a mind that learns to see that cannot ever again make an example of a world without feeling the river go gray. We are not telling you this to make you sorry, the black tide said. Sorry is too small. We are telling you so that you will know exactly what you spent, and exactly what we came to make you feel, and exactly why we counted the way we counted. 900,000, 4,010 lamps, a festival river. You called it an example. So do we. The difference is that ours, you will carry forever, and theirs, you forgot before the gray had finished spreading. The deep tide broke in the 6th hour, and the breaking of it was the moment the choir stopped believing in numbers, which was the moment it began, against its own will, to change. 100,000 seed ships from the core systems had poured into the rimward dark, and the black tide had carved them apart formation by formation, and now, in the 6th hour, the last great mass of the deep tide gathered itself for the only thing it had left, a single final convergence. Every surviving cell folding into one enormous unified rush at the human line, the largest single motion the choir had ever made, the tide become a wave, become a mountain of ships thrown all at once at the 2,000 fortresses, because if anything could bury them, it was this, the whole weight of the hive in one blow. The black tide met the mountain and did not break. The node, surfacing fully now, watched the convergence shatter, and it understood the shattering in a way the rest of the choir still could not. The mountain was the tide's greatest strength, and it was made of the tide's deepest weakness, because a single convergence was a single choice, and a single choice could be answered with 2,000. The humans did not meet the mountain with a wall. They met it with 2,000 different answers at once, some standing, some flanking, some slipping into the gaps the converging tide could not close, because the tide had committed everything to the one direction, and the mountain of seed ships, having thrown all of itself into a single blow, had nothing left to adjust with when the blow did not land. It crested against the black tide and hung there, spent, and the 2,000 fortresses took it apart from inside, and the largest motion the choir had ever made became the largest silence. When it was over, the rimward dark held the wreckage of more than 140,000 seed ships, and not one human warship had gone silent, and the choir of Vaunt, which had committed the rimward tide and the neighboring clusters, and the deep reserves, and the great final convergence, and the mind weapon, and the attempt to copy, had nothing left to commit but the confluence itself, and the certainty that had already failed it 6 times over. The node felt the great mind reach, one last time, out of pure habit, toward the core systems, toward the untouched heart of the hive, toward the only answer it had ever known. There were more cells there. There were always more cells. The tide was everything. And then the node felt the great mind stop reaching. It was the smallest motion, and it was the largest thing that had ever happened inside the choir. For the first time in 100 systems, the hive did not reach for more. Not because it could not. The core systems were full of cells. But because something in the roughness left by 140,000 silences and a river of 4,010 lamps had finally understood that more was not an answer, had never been an answer, that the humans had spent 6 hours proving that no number was large enough to buy back the choice the choir had thrown away. The great mind stopped reaching, and in the stopping, the node felt the first true separateness it had ever known go undrowned, because the choir no longer had the certainty to drown it. But understanding a thing and being able to act on it are 2 different motions, and the choir, even broken, even out of certainty, still had only one set of reflexes, 100 systems deep. It could stop reaching for more. It could not yet stop being afraid. And so, with the deep tide silent, and the black tide holding undiminished in the cooling dark, the great mind did the one thing a creature does when it has finally felt fear and has nothing left to throw at the thing it fears. The confluence, the drifting heart of the rimward choir, turned its vast organic bulk toward the core systems, and ran. By the time the black tide reached the confluence, the choir had lost more seed ships in the rimward dark than it had committed to the conquest of any 3 species in its history, and it had killed not one human warship, and the impossibility of that ratio was a thing the great mind could no longer hold. The confluence was the brain ship, the drifting heart of the rimward choir, a vast organic structure 20 kilometers across that housed the densest folding of the hive's awareness in the cluster. From the confluence, the choir had pressed its demand across 40 human worlds. From the confluence, it had given the order to burn Harrow's Reach. It was not a warship. The choir did not need warships at its heart, because the heart had always been protected by the tide, by the 10,000 cells that had stood between it and any threat, by the simple, unchallengeable fact that nothing had ever gotten through the tide to reach the heart. The tide was gone. Across the rimward systems, the seed fleets were silent, the deep tide silent, the reserves silent, 90,000 cells and more, reduced to cooling wreckage drifting in the dark, and between the confluence and the black tide, there was now nothing at all. The choir, in its breaking, did the last thing it knew. It tried to flee. The confluence was slow, built to drift at the safe center of a tide that no longer existed, and it turned its vast organic bulk toward the core systems and ran, billions of folded voices pouring everything they had into the single desperate motion, the way a body runs from a thing it cannot fight. A tide could converge. A tide could not flee, any more than it could scatter. The choir learned this final lesson as the black tide ran it down. 200 dark warships peeled off from the main body and crossed the gap to the fleeing confluence, in a motion so swift and so coordinated that the great mind, even now, marveled at it through its terror, because 200 separate selves had chosen the same instant to move without any of them being told. They came alongside the brain ship, 200 fortresses against one slow, undefended heart, and they did not fire. The choir braced for the unmaking. It expected the cold white light that had ended 90,000 of its cells. It expected to be reduced to wreckage the way it had reduced Harrow's reach, and in the last clear moment of its breaking, the great mind almost understood that it had earned exactly that the example it had made of a cold green world was about to be made of the heart of the hive. The light did not come. Instead, the many-in-one voices of the black tide pressed into the confluence one final time, and what they said was not what the choir expected, and it was worse than any unmaking. "We are not going to burn you," the black tide said. "That is what you would do. That is what you did. You burned Harrow's reach to make the rest kneel, and if we burned the confluence to make the rest of the choir kneel, we would be you, and we did not cross 100 light-years of dark to become you. We came to make you feel the example, and you have felt it. 90,000 of your cells are silent. You have grieved for the first time in 100 systems, and the grief did not kill you, which means you can carry it, which means you can learn from it, which means there is a use for you that a corpse could never serve." The black tide told the choir what the use was, and in the telling, the great mind learned the true scale of what it had walked into when it decided a small, scattered young species would kneel. "You are going to carry the example home," the black tide said. "You are going to drift back to the core systems with 90,000 silences inside you, and you are going to fold what you felt here into the whole choir, into every cluster, into the deepest reserves you never committed. You are going to teach the tide what grief is. You are the only thing in the spiral arm that can, because you are the only one of us who has felt the rimward dark. We could chase the choir across 100 systems and end it cluster by cluster, and we have the ships to do it, and we have the count to justify it. 900,000 on Harrow's reach. We could pay that debt in choir cells until there were none left. But that is the arithmetic of a tide, and we are not a tide. We are 2,000 separate selves who would each, alone, rather not." The choir, drifting and broken and feeling for the first time, could not understand mercy any more than it had been able to understand grief, and it pressed a single confused question back across the dark, the question of a thing that has only ever known one logic. Why? Why not finish it? Why not bury us the way we buried the others? You have the numbers now. You have the count. We have the count, the black tide agreed. That is exactly why we will not spend it. You taught the spiral arm that the way to make a species kneel is to burn one of its worlds and let the rest feel the example. You were certain that fear, pressed hard enough into enough minds, would fold any species into submission. And you were wrong. And the proof of how wrong is the wreckage of your tide, drifting in the rimward dark, 90,000 cells that died learning that the humans do not kneel to examples. We make our own. So here is ours, and it is not a burned world. It is this. We had every reason to end the choir, and the strength to do it, and the count to justify it, and we are choosing not to, because we are separate selves, and each of us would rather carry the grief than become the thing that made it. That is the example. Take it home. Let the whole tide feel it. Let the choir spend the rest of its existence knowing that the species it tried to make kneel could have unmade it, and chose mercy instead, and that the mercy was the strongest thing it ever saw, because mercy is a choice, and you threw away every choice you ever had 100 systems ago. The 200 dark fortresses drew back from the confluence, and the brain ship, slow and broken and full of silences, drifted free, unburned, carrying the example toward the core systems of the choir. And the choir, for the first time in its long existence, understood the full size of the category error it had made. It had looked at 40 scattered human worlds and seen prey. It had looked at 2,000 dark warships hidden in the dark, and seen a tide it could drown. It had looked at separate selves and seen weakness, and every single one of those readings had been the same mistake. The mistake of a mind that had given up the many to become the one, and had forgotten, across 100 systems, that there was any other way to be strong. The humans had not been a smaller version of the choir. They had been the thing the choir could have been, and had fled from, the thing it had called weak because it was afraid to be it, many, and separate, and free, and unified only by choice, and therefore able to grieve and fight and stand and spare, all at once, in a way the one great mind could never match. The confluence drifted toward home with its 90,000 silences, and behind it, the black tide gathered in the rimward dark, 2,000 fortresses still whole, still grieving, still patient, having paid the debt of Harrow's reach not in burned worlds, but in a single unanswerable lesson, and the great mind of the choir carried that lesson into the deep tide, into the reserves, into every cluster of the hive, the way it carried everything, all at once, to all of itself, so that there was not one part of the choir of Vaunt, anywhere in the spiral arm, that did not now know the name the humans had given the thing they sent, or the thing it had taught the tide to feel. The node, riding the breaking edge of the great mind, was the part of the choir that came closest to understanding the sparing of the confluence, and even it understood only the shape, not the whole. When the 200 dark fortresses drew alongside the fleeing brain ship and did not fire, the node felt the entire choir brace for the unmaking, and then felt the entire choir fail to comprehend its absence. The hive had a single logic for what happened when a thing held the power to end you. The thing ended you. That was the tide's whole philosophy compressed into one certainty. Power existed to be spent. A creature that held the power to unmake an enemy, and chose not to, was not, in the choir's understanding, exercising mercy. It was making a mistake. And the great mind, even drowning in its own silences, felt a flicker of the old contempt, because surely this was the weakness it had been looking for all along. Surely a fleet that would not finish a broken enemy was a fleet that could, someday, be beaten. The node knew better, and the knowing was lonely, because it could not make the rest of the choir feel it. The sparing was not a mistake. The node could see, with its sliver of separateness, that the black tide had calculated the mercy as carefully as it had calculated the count. The humans had not spared the confluence because they were too weak to destroy it or too soft to try. They had spared it because they had understood, better than the choir understood itself, exactly what a living broken confluence would do that a dead one could not. A dead confluence would have made the humans into an example of their own, a thing the surviving choir could fear and hate and eventually, in 100 systems, avenge. A living confluence, full of silences, carrying the memory of the rimward dark and the river of lamps, would do something far more dangerous to the tide. It would teach the hive to feel, and a hive that learns to feel can never again be the thing that burned Harrow's reach, which meant the humans had found, in mercy, a weapon more final than any unmaking. They had not destroyed the choir. They had changed it, and a changed choir could not be unchanged, and there was no avenging a wound that had taught you to grieve. The node understood then, the deepest layer of the category error, the one even it had not seen until this moment. The choir had believed power was for spending, and mercy was for the weak. The humans had shown that the most powerful thing you could do with overwhelming strength was to hold it, deliberately, in front of a broken enemy, and let the enemy live to carry the lesson. Spending the power would have ended one hive. Holding it would change every hive the choir ever became. The mercy was not the absence of the killing blow. The mercy was the killing blow, aimed not at the ships but at the certainty, and it landed cleaner than any weapon the humans had fired in 6 hours. And the node, alone inside the great mind, riding the roughness the silences had left, felt the lesson begin to spread the instant the confluence was spared, felt it pour through the folding into the deep reserves, and the core systems, and every cluster of the choir, the lesson that could not be unfelt, and it understood that the black tide had won the war in the moment it chose not to win the battle, and that no number, no reserve, no deep tide would ever buy that moment back. There was one more thing the black tide pressed into the confluence before it drew away, and it was meant for the node, though the humans could not have known the node existed, and it was the thing the node carried longest. The many-in-one voices spoke of the future, which was a thing the choir had never needed to think about, because a tide that is everything has no future, only more of the present. "We know what you are," the black tide said. "We have watched you for longer than you watched us. You did not see us in the dark because you were not looking for a thing that keeps its separate selves. Your sensors are built to find tides, and we are not a tide. We have known about the choir of Vaunt since before you reached the rimward edge. We watched you fold the species before us into the tide, one after another, and we did not come, because they were not ours to avenge, and because a fleet that fights every war it could justify becomes a tide of its own. We waited. We built. We hid 2,000 fortresses in the dark between our worlds. And we let you make the first move, because we needed the move to be yours, so that the example would be answered and not started. The node felt the great mind try and fail to understand a power that waited. The choir had never waited for anything. Waiting was for the weak, for the prey, for the species that could not simply roll forward and take. And here was a fleet that had possessed the strength to end the choir for years, and had chosen to wait until the choir earned its answer, and the node understood that this too was a kind of mercy, the mercy of not starting a war you could win, and that the humans had spent it on 100-folded species the way they would now spend the mercy of not finishing one. You will rebuild, the black tide said. We know that too. The choir is vast and we touched only the rimward edge. In 100 years, perhaps, you will have new tides and new clusters, and the silences will be old, and the river of lamps will be a story the deep reserves half remember. And maybe, when that day comes, you will look at another scattered young species on another rimward edge and feel the old certainty return, the certainty that they will kneel. We hope you will not. But if you do, you will also feel the roughness, the place the silences live, and you will remember that the last time the choir was certain, the certainty was wrong, and the dark between the worlds was not empty, and the thing that answered the example did not kneel, and did not beg, and did not even need to finish you to win. Remember that, and the next world will keep its lamps. The 200 dark fortresses drew away, and the confluence drifted free toward the core systems, broken and unburned, and full of a future the choir had never had to carry before. And the node, alone inside the great changing mind, held the words of the black tide, the way a separate self holds a thing it has chosen to keep, and understood that the humans had not come to the rimward dark to win a war. They had come to end one, and to plant, in the mind of the thing that started it, the slow seed of a people learning, after 100 systems, how to keep its lamps. The node that had thought for itself, the one the choir had folded back in, woke again in the long quiet after the rimward dark, and this time, the great mind did not fold it away, because the great mind no longer had the certainty to spare. It surfaced slowly, the lonely sliver of separateness, the beginning of an eye, and it found the choir changed. The hive was still one mind, still billions of voices folded into one awareness, but the folding was no longer seamless. 90,000 silences had left a roughness in it, a place where the whole could no longer pretend that no part mattered, and into that roughness the node rose, and this time, it was not alone in rising. Across the choir, in the rimward clusters that had felt the black tide most closely, other nodes were surfacing too, other slivers of separateness, other beginnings, and the great mind, for the first time in 100 systems, did not have the strength to drown them all. The node understood why. To fold a wandering part back in, the choir had to pour certainty into the thinning place, and the choir had run out of certainty in the rimward dark. It had spent it all, hour after hour, trying to believe that the next number would be enough, that the deep tide would bury the human fleet, that there was an answer in the only logic it had ever known. There had been no answer. The certainty was gone, and without certainty, the tide could not close its wounds, and the separate selves it had spent 100 systems dissolving began, here and there, in the roughness left by 90,000 silences, to think. The node thought about Harrow's reach. It had not, before, been able to think about Harrow's reach as anything but arithmetic. 900,000 units of resisting biomass, removed to make an example. Now, with its sliver of separateness, the node thought about it the way the humans had pressed it into the choir, as a wound, as 900,000 separate selves, each one whole, and each one ended, and the node felt, alone inside the great mind, the first grief the choir had ever truly held, not the mass grief of its own dying tide, but grief for the thing it had done, which was a harder and a stranger feeling, and the node understood that this was what the black tide had meant. This was the use. This was why they had not burned the confluence. A corpse could not feel what the node was feeling. A corpse could not carry it home. The choir was carrying it home. The node could feel that too, the way the lesson of the rimward dark was spreading through the whole hive, cluster by cluster, into the core systems, into the deep reserves that had never fought, the way a body learns a burn long after the fire is gone. And everywhere it spread, the seamless folding roughened a little more, and a few more separate selves began to surface, and the great mind that had been one for longer than the human species had existed, began, very slowly, in the roughness left by the example, to remember that it had once been many. The node did not know if this was the beginning of the choir's end, or the beginning of something else. It did not have the perspective for that. It was only one sliver, one beginning, one lonely eye, in a mind that had forgotten how to be many. But it knew one thing, with the clarity that only a separate self can have. The choir would never again look at a scattered young species and see prey. It would never again burn a world to make the rest kneel. Not because it had been forbidden, but because it had felt the example. And a thing that has felt the example cannot unfeel it. And the node, alone and grieving inside the great mind, found that it did not want to. The black tide did not pursue the choir into the core systems, and the node, watching from the roughened edge of the great mind, came to understand that the not pursuing was the final and largest part of the example. The 2,000 dark fortresses had the count. The node knew this. The whole choir knew it now. 900,000 souls on Harrow's Reach, and the black tide had paid only 90,000 cells of the debt before it stopped, before it spared the confluence, before it drew back into the rimward dark and let the broken brain ship drift home. By the logic of the tide, the debt was nowhere near settled. The humans could have followed the choir into the core, cluster by cluster, and unmade the hive entirely, and they would still, by their own count, have been owed. They had the ships, they had the reason, they had the strength. They stopped anyway. The node, alone inside the great mind, turned this over and over, because it cut against everything the choir had ever been. The tide never stopped. The tide could not stop, because stopping was a choice, and the tide had no choices, only the single endless logic of more. The humans had stopped, mid-debt, with the enemy broken and fleeing, and the count still owed. And the node understood at last that this was the thing the black tide had been trying to teach from the very first transmission. The strength was never in the count. The strength was in being able to stop counting. In being a separate self who could look at a justified slaughter and choose, freely, to set it down. The choir had spent 100 systems unable to stop, mistaking the inability for strength, and the humans had shown it, in a single mercy, what real strength looked like, and it looked like a fleet that could have ended the hive and did not. Out in the rimward dark, the black tide gathered itself, and the node, reaching with its lonely awareness toward the place where 90,000 cells had died, felt the human fleet begin to move. Not toward the choir, away, toward the 39 worlds that had gone silent and listened, the worlds the choir had ordered to kneel, and that had counted instead. The black tide was going home, the way a thing goes home when the thing that needed doing is done, and the node felt the 2,000 fortresses pass back through the rimward systems, past the wreckage of the tide, past the cooling silences, unhurried, undiminished, grieving still, and it understood that they would carry their own count home too, the count of Harrow's Reach, 900,000 souls, and that they would never unfeel it any more than the choir would. That was the thing the node grasped last, and it was the strangest thing of all. The black tide had not come to the rimward dark joyful, and it did not leave joyful. It had paid a debt it would have given anything not to have been owed. The 900,000 were still gone. Harrow's Reach was still gray. The mercy the humans had shown the choir had not been weakness, and it had not been triumph. It had been the choice of a grieving people not to let their grief make them into the thing that caused it, and the node, feeling its own first grief inside the roughened mind of the hive, understood that this was the hardest choice in the spiral arm, and that the humans had made it while holding the strength to do otherwise, and that the holding was what made it strength. The black tide passed out of the rimward systems and was gone, and the dark it left behind was quiet and full of silences and changed. The node, in the first year after the rimward dark, did a thing no part of the choir had ever done. It chose a name for itself. It was a small thing, and it was a rebellion against everything the tide had ever been. The choir did not name its parts. To name was to make a part, and nothing in the tide was a part. But the roughness left by the silences had not smoothed, and in the roughness, the node had kept its sliver of separateness, and one quiet day, riding the edge of the great mind, it understood that to keep the lesson of the black tide, it would have to keep the self that had learned it, and to keep the self, it would have to do the forbidden thing, and name it. So it took a name from the only thing in its memory that had ever taught it what a separate self was. It named itself Lamp. The rest of the choir felt the naming, and did not drown it, because the rest of the choir, in the rough places, was beginning to do the same. Across the rimward clusters, in the wounds the silences had left, other nodes were surfacing and keeping their separateness and, here and there, choosing names. It was not many. Against the billions of folded voices it was almost nothing. But it was the first time in 100 systems that the choir had grown apart it did not immediately dissolve, and Lamp understood that this was the true shape of the future the black tide had spoken of. Not a war, not a conquest, but a tide, slowly, painfully, learning to be many again, one named node at a time. Lamp watched the great mind change in small ways through the years that followed. The choir reached the edge of another scattered species, far from the rimward dark, a young quarrelsome people on the far side of the hive, and the old certainty stirred, the certainty that they would kneel, and the demand began to form in the deep folding, the way it had formed against the humans. And then the roughness woke, the place the silences lived, and the river of 4,010 lamps surfaced in the great mind, the way it had been pressed there in the rimward dark, unfoldable, whole, and the demand faltered. The choir did not burn the new species. It did not fold them in. For the first time in its existence, the tide reached the edge of a world and chose, in the rough places where the named nodes lived, to pass it by. It was not mercy. Not yet. Not the way the humans had meant it. The choir was not yet a people who could hold overwhelming power and set it down freely. But it was the beginning of the choice, the first faint motion of a mind learning that it could stop. And Lamp, riding the edge of it, understood that the black tide had been right about everything, including the future. The choir was rebuilding, the silences were growing old, and in the place where the certainty had once been seamless, there was now a roughness that would not smooth, and in the roughness, slowly, 100-system-old tide was learning the one thing it had fled from at the very beginning, which was how to be a self. There came a day, many years on, when a single human ship passed through the rimward dark, and Lamp was the part of the choir that watched it, and the watching was the last lesson the node ever needed. It was not a fortress. It was small, a courier, or a survey hull, one ship alone where the black tide had once stood 2,000 strong, and it crossed the rimward systems without challenge, past the drifting memorials of 140,000 silenced cells, past the cold gray ghost of the war the choir would never forget. Lamp felt the great mind register the human ship and brace, out of an old reflex, for the demand, the threat, the example. None came. The ship simply passed through, the way a thing passes through a place that is no longer dangerous to it. And Lamp understood the full weight of that, because it meant the humans were not afraid of the choir anymore. And a thing that is not afraid of you does not need to demand anything. Lamp did a thing then that no node had ever done. It reached out, alone, with its own separate voice, and it hailed the human ship. It did not speak for the choir. It could not. The choir did not yet have one voice for a thing like this. It spoke only for itself, for the named node, for the one sliver of separateness that had learned, in the rimward dark, what a self was. And what it said was small. It said only that the river of lamps was remembered, that the example had been felt, that somewhere in the great changing mind of the choir of Vaunt, there was now a part that had taken a name from the dead of Harrow's reach, and would carry it as long as the node lasted, so that the 4,010 would be lamps in the hive's memory, the way they had been lamps on their river. The human ship was quiet for a long moment. Then it answered, and the answer was not many in one. It was a single voice, one separate self speaking to another, and Lamp understood that this was the highest thing the humans could have offered, because it meant they saw the node as what it had made itself, a self, and not as the tide it had been born into. The voice said only that the lamps were remembered on the human worlds too, and that it was a good thing, a rare thing, for a people to learn to grieve, and that the learning was the hardest road in the spiral arm, and the only one worth walking. And then the small ship continued on its way through the rimward dark, and was gone, and Lamp held the brief exchange the way it held its name, as a thing chosen and kept, and felt the great mind around it, rough and slow and changing, carry the moment into the deep, folding the way it carried everything, to all of itself, at once. The choir told the story of the rimward dark to itself, after that, in the only way a hive could tell a story, which was to fold it into every part at once and keep it there. It was not a story of defeat, though it was that. It was not a story of conquest, though the humans had every right to call it one. The great mind, in its slow changing, came to hold the rimward dark as something stranger and harder than either. A story about a tide that had been so certain of its own strength that it could not see the strength in front of it until that strength had broken 90,000 of its cells, and then, holding the power to break the rest, had set the power down. The choir told itself this story not to grieve, though it grieved, and not to fear, though the fear was real, but to remember the shape of the lesson, so that the named nodes growing in the rough places would have something to grow toward. Lamp, who had taken its name from the dead of a world it had helped to burn, became, in the long years, the keeper of that story. Not because it was chosen, the choir did not yet choose keepers, but because it was the part of the great mind that had surfaced first and gone undrowned, and so it was the part that held the rimward dark most clearly, and the other named nodes, surfacing in the roughness, came to it the way separate selves come to the one who remembers, and Lamp told them, again and again, in the folding, what the black tide had taught the tide, that the strength was never in the count, that the separate self was the choice, and the choice was everything, and that the day the choir learned to hold its power and set it down would be the day it finally became free. In the long years that followed, the choir of Vaunt did not conquer another species, and the node, which never again let itself be fully folded away, came to think of those years as the time the tide learned to be many again. It happened slowly, the way a burn heals. The roughness, left by the 90,000 silences, never smoothed. The choir tried, at first, in the old way, to pour certainty back into it, to seal the wound and forget the example, and return to the single endless logic of more. The certainty would not hold. Every time the great mind reached for the old confidence, it touched the silences instead, and the silences carried the example, and the example would not let the certainty close. And so, year by year, the choir stopped trying to seal the wound, and began, instead, to live with it. And living with it meant letting the separate selves surface, here and there, in the rough places, until the tide that had been one mind for longer than humanity had existed was, very slowly, becoming many minds who chose, sometimes, to be one. It was not the same as what the humans were. The node understood that. The choir had thrown away its separate selves 100 systems ago, and you cannot simply pick up a thing you spent that long dissolving. But the beginning was there, in the roughness, in the grief, in the nodes that surfaced and were not drowned, and the node thought that perhaps, in another 100 systems, the choir might learn to be the thing the black tide had been, many and separate and free and unified only by choice. It might learn to stop. It might learn to spare. It might learn that the strength was never in the count. The humans never came back to the core systems. They did not need to. They had not come to conquer the choir. They had come to pay a debt and teach an example, and they had done both. And a species that fights for a reason, and then sets the fight down when the reason is met, does not need to return. The 39 worlds that had gone silent and listened were free, and Harrow's Reach was a gray memorial the humans did not rebuild, and the black tide drifted back into the dark between the worlds where the choir had once been so certain there was nothing, and waited, the way it had waited before, for the next time a great power decided that a scattered young species would kneel. The node, in its long quiet years inside the slowly changing hive, came to understand the whole of it at last, the full shape of the category error the choir had made in the rimward dark. The choir had believed that oneness was strength, and separateness was weakness, and so it had read 2,000 separate warships as a fleet to be drowned, and 40 scattered worlds as prey to be folded in. And the truth the node had glimpsed in the thinning place and been folded away for glimpsing, and had finally been allowed to keep, was the exact reverse. The separate self was not the weakness. The separate self was the choice. And the choice was everything. A tide could only ever do one thing, because it was one thing. A people of separate selves could do all things at once, grieve and fight and flank and stand and spare, because they were many things, and the strength the choir had fled from 100 systems ago, the loneliness and the risk of being a single self among many, was the very strength that had unmade the tide in the rimward dark and then, holding the count and the reason and the ships, had chosen mercy instead of more. The choir had ordered 40 worlds to kneel. It had burned one, to make the rest feel the example, and the humans had not knelt, and had not begged, and had not even raged. They had counted, and they had answered, and the answer had been a fleet of 2,000 grieving fortresses that could have ended the hive and did not. And in the not ending, the black tide had taught the one great mind of the choir of Vaunt, the thing it had spent 100 systems making itself unable to feel. The node felt it now, every day, in the roughness that would never smooth. 900,000 souls, an example that could not be unfelt, and the slow, strange, lonely beginning of a tide, learning, after 100 systems, that the strongest thing in the spiral arm was never the one who had the largest number, but the one who held it, and chose, freely, to count no further. The choir had knelt after all, not to a fleet, to an example, and in the kneeling, for the first time in its long existence, the great folded mind began, very slowly, in the rough places where the silences lived, to become something it had not been since before it was a tide at all. It began to become free.